what America was and what it can become. This is Liberty Town Hall.
And welcome to Liberty Town Hall. We're joined in studio today by Ken Thompson and Tom Dunn. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming back. On our last show, last time you were here, we were speaking about property rights. And we were talking about the Frost Convention. Can you bring the audience up to speed on what the Frost Convention is, and how it affects us real quick in a summary?
Well, it was the Frostbite Convention, though it was a frosty day.
I'm sorry, Frostbite Convention.
Yeah, but that's okay. It was very frosty. It was held in Ann Arbor in December of 1836.
Okay.
It was a directed result of Michigan state citizens standing up within the state constitution of 1835 and dismissing the state legislature that sat in Detroit in the summer of 1836. For the legislature in the summer of 1836 would not accept the Enabling Act that eventually brought our state into the Union in January of 1837. So the Michiganders said, well, if you won't listen to us, we'll get rid of you. And under the state constitution of 1835, as it is applicable today, they voted out the state legislature in September of 1836, held the convention, or the new legislative body, in Ann Arbor on December 14th and 15th. And the result was they accepted the Enabling Act of April of 1836, which established the current southern boundary of Michigan, and we gratuitously accepted the Upper Peninsula.
And that's when we picked up the UP and all
Correct.
that, right? But what's the important part of that? We actually overturned what the legislators wanted to do by a vote of the people?
By the constitutional authorities of the state constitution, yes. The people got together, the citizens, the voting qualified voters, and voted a new legislative assembly.
Okay.
And it was such a dramatic act that in the floor of the federal Senate in January of 1837, John C. Calhoun denounced the Frostbite Convention, the one who battled Andrew Jackson previously over the Tariff Act of 1828, pardon me, the abominable tariff. But the point being is that, yes, state citizens stood up and held the state actors accountable.
Okay, so what's the important part about the convention with today's property rights?
It shows that we as state citizens have the constitutional ability to enforce the rule of law upon a tyrannical government.
You sound like we're not running by the rule of law.
No, we're not. We have been outside the law, operating under what's called the color of law for generations, over 100 years in our state specifically.
Well, what part about it is not, is it a jurisdictional problem?
It's a constitutional and statutory conflict.
Okay.
The state has an absolute right to abide within the federal and state constitution limitations for its physical authority, for its right to raise funds.
Now this is the same pretty much with all the states.
All the states are contiguous, correct.
Right.
For we are first off a republic form of government, where we elect our representatives to represent our will, not theirs. Mm-hmm. And this is going to awry the past 100-odd years since the rise of Theodore Roosevelt and the progressive movement, which started literally at the federal level and worked its way down. And the result is we have lost sight and understanding of our history. We no longer understand the rule of law, and we have been literally put in a jurisdiction best described as the color of law. And the color of law is literally what it is. It is coloring the authorities of the reach of governmental actors. And they do this when we don't understand how to literally object. And the Frostbite Convention shows historically we knew how to object. But that's before we walk around into these progressively controlled schools of public education.
So I just want to get this straight. At one point we had property rights in Michigan. And now, over the last 100 years, you're saying our individual property rights have been dwindled down because of a progressive movement in the state legislators or at the federal legislative level?
Well, we haven't really taken, as individuals and property owners, we haven't taken the steps that it takes to stand up for our own property rights. If you said it was raining out and I said it wasn't raining out, everybody believes it. It's raining out. So there's things that you have to do as a man and a woman on your property to take those steps to make sure that the jurisdiction of your property is your property and not their property, and know how to properly stand up and have standing.
Some people make the case that we really don't even own our property anymore because of the land taxes that are going on so much that if you don't pay your land taxes within a year, they can pretty much foreclose on your properties anymore. So really we're kind of renting the property from the government now instead of owning it. Is that fundamentally a change that you see happening all across the country?
That is the color of law. You've just described the color of law. You've absolutely described it. You described a feudal state where we're paying a fee in simple to maintain our position on our own private property. And they being the governmental actors at all levels, and there are levels of government actors who are not aware of that, why they're wrong. Because you have an anachronism of contemporaneous wrongs become, historical wrongs become contemporaneous rights.
So if you break the rule of law and nobody complains about it, the next group we elect in says, well, that's what they did, so that's what we do. And it continues on, and now over time we've lost the meaning of actually owning our property is what you're trying to get at here, right?
You're 100% on point.
Right? Well, when we come back, we're going to get into just how your property rights can be protected. We're going to talk about that. But we're also going to talk about the value of jurisdictions and where the jurisdictions really play a role in our individual rights. We'll be right back with more at Liberty Town Hall. And welcome back to Liberty Town Hall. We're sitting here talking about property rights, jurisdictions, who owns our property versus who doesn't. I guess that's really what it boils down to. Are we renting property, or do we actually own title to it now, or deed to it, or warrant deeds, or whatever? Can you guys talk about how that mindset has changed over the years?
Well, again, when property was originally ceded to the federal government by the state of Michigan, and
this was the Frostbite Convention.
Through the Frostbite Convention, but through all the states.
Yep.
Basically was all the same. When that property went to the federal government took jurisdiction over that property. The federal government then did surveys and they did their field notes. Once that was done, then that property was issued to whoever purchased it or back to the state of Michigan to issue a patent on that property based on a congressional act.
Okay, so there was a patent, not a warranty deed. There's a difference right there, right?
Oh, the patent was absolutely the first documents that were issued by the federal government. And this is a patent, if we can see it here. And this patent, again, happens to be one for Ken's property in Ionia County. Originally, that patent was issued to a Mr. Woods. Jurisdiction at that point, when that patent was issued to Mr. Woods, to his heirs and or assigns,
right,
jurisdiction flowed on that property,
right,
to the heir and or assign.
Yes, which eventually is how you got it.
I am now the assign from the original patent.
Okay. Did he have to pay land taxes every year on this?
Only in 1861.
He did in 1861.
Because in 1861, on August 6th, the Federal Congress, to fund the insurrection, the battle against the insurrection, the Civil War, yes, pardon my tongue. 1861, they passed a direct tax, the fourth direct tax in our history.
Okay.
And the direct tax to Michigan was a cost of $550,1861, gold and silver.
We're going to get into that when we talk about our monetary policies here coming about.
Yes.
I noticed the pun, but it was really valued at versus today.
Correct.
Right? Yes.
And it was 550,000 gold and silver dollars. And it's a very interesting time of events for Michigan not being an insurrectory state. The federal government assessed the state, and the state, under its own apparatus, turned around to collect the taxes payable, because it was a tax not upon you and I, but upon the state itself.
Right.
Now, the state had options. The state had general funds, which they had generated over certain tax policies. And if there was a deficit, then they could turn around and apportion the deficit upon all property owners, landowners in the state upon assessed values. That's how it worked.
Okay.
And it's interesting because Public Act 1 of January of 1862 in Michigan, the state legislature wanted the Auditor General of our state to bill back the cost of mobilizing our volunteer forces to the service of the Army of the Republic, to invade basically the southern states to reinstate the laws. So they wanted a balancing act, and then we'd pay the difference.
So now, was that supposed to be an ongoing tax every year from that point on?
No, it was a
one-time tax.
One-time hit, and it was a $20 million tax bill in 1861. And it was spread amongst all the states, and I mean all the states, inclusive of the 13 Confederate states, because they were not considered by the federal legislature to be outside the jurisdiction.
Right, they were still states as far as the federal government is concerned.
Correct. Yes. They were just in a little bit of an argument, a very bloody argument as it turned out to be. And these are parts of the history that we're not shared with anymore for purpose. For if I can hide from you your history, I can tell you whatever I want you to believe today.
So how did we get to the point where we're having to pay taxes year after year, basically renting property now?
Well, I guess my wife says it best. They hit the jackpot because they kept sending out the assessors and people kept sending in the money. Nobody challenged it.
No, with no real legal authority to do that.
None at all.
But today there is.
No, there's not.
Well,
it's called the color of authority. And this is when it comes down to understanding jurisdiction and subject matter.
Well, we really got two issues going on kind of at the same time. We got the value of money and how it's being distributed and how it's been deflated, which is a property value. It's the value of what we own that we take up in these Federal Reserve notes, and our real properties in which we have the land.
Right. Both
have been basically under the color of law, been diluted in ownership and power, correct?
And it all started, the whole gambit was the Civil War. You need to get into the journals of the Federal Congress between 1861 and 1868. It's extremely interesting reading. For we currently operate under a central bank, a private bank called the Federal Reserve. Now, the precursor of the Federal Reserve was the 1863 National Bank Act. Very interesting reading. For under federal statute, you could charter yourself a national charter bank and bring that bank in to operate in Michigan as a national charter bank, comity of laws. And under the 1863 statute as amended in 1864, you didn't need to have gold and silver to write your notes.
We have to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to get into a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island. This book here describes the Federal Reserve and how it come into play. And when we return, we'll talk about these central banks and how they manage to control our money. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Liberty Town Hall. We're discussing personal property rights, the value of our property, and the value of our monetary currency we're using in America. Guys, I guess in order to figure out value, we have to figure out if we own our property or rent it. That would be important to figure out what our property is really worth. And second of all, what the value is of the currency we're using to pay for it is. So I wanted to bring up the Federal Reserve because there was a 100-year charter for the Federal Reserve, and it's actually expiring in 2013. Nobody's talking about this, but I think that we really need to take the time to address the Federal Reserve. And that book, that I guess the book that really explains it the best is The Creature from Jekyll Island. And most people say, the Creature from Jekyll Island, what's the Jekyll Island? Well, Jekyll Island is an actual island in Atlanta. This book actually talks about how the Federal Reserve was formed. And basically, from what I can tell from the reading in here, is it was done by 6 individuals, basically in the secret dark of the night. They snuck off on a train down to Jekyll Island and come up with the concept of the Federal Reserve. What do you guys think the Federal Reserve really is? I mean, what would you guys come up with if you were putting a name on the Federal Reserve?
I would like to say it's a great fiction. Because when our money is being printed by our Treasury, what is it worth? Who buys that money? Where does that money come from? That money comes from our Treasury bought by the Federal Reserve for what, 23 cents or 21 cents, $100 today?
It's printed paper. Federal Reserve is a legal fiction. It's a statutory monopoly.
It's a statutory monopoly.
It's a statutory monopoly. It is the centralization of capital. The means of production of a capitalist society is redundant. It's capital. You control the means of that capital, you control me.
Well, Rothschild said, "Give me control of the nation's money supply and I care not who makes its laws." I thought that was a pretty pronounced statement coming from one of the founders of the Federal Reserve. They control our money supply, plain and simple.
It's ambiguous. Yes, as an operational entity, as a legal fiction, which they are, yes, they do control the money supply, but only upon the authority of the federal Congress.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Federal Reserve. So I got two questions. What's federal about it, and what reserve is there?
What's federal about it is there was a federal law that created it, that authorized it, as they like to say at midnight on December 23rd.
So it's a governmental entity.
It is a governmentally chartered entity.
But it's privately owned.
It's a government charter under private concession.
Okay, so who owns the Fed?
The member banks, and the member banks are owned by private shareholders.
And most of those banks are majority owned by U.S. citizens, or is there a lot of foreigners?
It's a kaleidoscope. Anybody can be an investor in a bank stock.
So you really can't say foreigners own our money?
Not necessarily so.
Okay.
But given the money window out of the First Federal Reserve Bank in New York, I'm sure Deutsche Bank has its hands heavily into stocks.
Okay. The Federal Reserve is a private bank, bottom line, and they're creating our money. So we have Federal Reserve notes now. They're not U.S. dollars, they're Federal Reserve notes.
Correct.
There's a fine distinction between the two. I mean, because it's our nation's currency platform, but it is a Federal Reserve note. In other words, it's a private bank, a private company's note, like a check.
You need to go back to the original act in 13 and trace it forward for 20 years, to March 3rd of 1933, when by executive memorandum, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, closed all nationally chartered banks.
Okay.
At the same time, they did not close the national banks in Canada, just as a juxtaposition of physical responsibility. Between 1913 and 1933, there were Federal Reserve gold notes. They were gold notes.
Right. Now, those were printed by the Federal Reserve.
Correct.
But they had to have it backed up by gold or silver.
Gold. Gold reserve.
Okay, silver didn't come into play yet then?
Silver was in play, but it did not back the gold notes. It wasn't a silver certificate, which was issued in 1963, jumping ahead, pardon me, in 61 by under the authority of John F. Kennedy.
So at that point, we went from gold to silver.
Well, basically they used, silver notes in 1961 currencies, yes. Right. But the Federal Reserve was predicated upon gold, because there was a political battle between gold and silver. If you remember 1898, William Jennings Bryan Cross of Gold speech, which made him a national phenomenon at the Democratic National Convention. Don't hang my soul on a cross of gold.
So do these banks have all the nation's wealth? Is that how they're able to do this, or are they just printing money out of clear blue sky now?
They are fractionalizing the money.
A fractional reserve
fractional reserve system. So for every your checking account is a demand deposit transaction account.
Okay. And
when you get in behind the statutory filter of the manipulation of our currency, you can understand how a $750 billion TARP statute in September of 2008 turned into a $16 trillion funding window through the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. Now, that's fractionalization, and that's what they've been doing since 1913. And what happened in the first 20 years is they oversubscribed the gold notes. They had too many notes.
They had
and
too
not
many
enough
notes,
of-
so then they had to get rid of that.
Right. Well, they closed the bank for 5 days.
Well, we're running out of time today, but we need to get back into the Federal Reserve. I think that's a very important thing. Tom, Ken, we ran out of time today. Hope you come join us again. Thank you for joining us today. That's all we have today on Liberty Town Hall. See you next time.
The only constitutional exception to the power of making treaties is that it shall not change the Constitution. On natural principles, a treaty which should manifestly betray or sacrifice primary interests of the state would be null. Alexander Hamilton, the works of Alexander Hamilton, 1796.